What's the most urgent health problem facing the United States at this time? Well, that's exactly the question we've asked Americans since 1987. We ask it off and on between 1987 and the early 2000s, but since November of 2001, we've asked it every single November. Let's look at diseases first. That's what Americans' instinct was in response to that question back when we first started asking it, and specifically, it was AIDS. Look at that number in front of you. 68% of Americans back in October of 1987 said the most urgent health problem facing the United States was AIDS, and that shows you how prevalent concern about AIDS was at that point. Large percentages of Americans continued to mention AIDS for years thereafter, but then it began to drop. And by the early 2000s, we were down into single digits, and now just 1% of Americans say that AIDS is the most urgent health problem facing this country. The other health problem that has been mentioned with significant frequency has been cancer, but perhaps not as frequently as you might think. The numbers go up and go down of the percent of Americans who mention cancer. The high point was 23% back in February of 1999. Nowadays, in our most recent update, 13% of Americans say that cancer is the most important problem facing the country. What about heart disease? I think medical researchers tell us that cardiovascular heart disease is actually one of the major killers of Americans today, and yet right now, only 1% of Americans say that's the most urgent health problem facing the country, and through the years, relatively small percents of Americans have ever mentioned heart disease as our top problem. One problem that has come up in its frequency of mention is obesity. Americans have mentioned obesity off and on over the years, but now we're up to 14% of Americans who say obesity is the top problem, same as last year, and that's the highest for obesity that we've ever seen. So clearly, a lot of this discussion about how obesity is bad for the nation's health is percolating through to the average American. Let me shift now over to non-health problems, and that's what really dominates right now, and that would be two categories. Access to health, that would be health insurance, being able to get to health care when you need it, and also cost. Those percentages have come up and down over the years, but right now 27% of Americans say the most urgent health problem facing the U.S. is getting access to health care. That would be health insurance. That's the number one category. And the second category is cost. 20% of Americans say that's the most urgent health problem facing the country today. So when you ask Americans right now about the most urgent health problem, it is not a disease, but it is actually access and costs that rule the roost, so to speak, here in November of 2011, followed by obesity and then cancer, and then all other problems mentioned by 3% or fewer of Americans. That's an update for you on what Americans say is our most urgent health problem. I'm Dr. Frank Newport, Gallup Editor-in-Chief.